Hi, I'm Rob Penzak, a physician turned writer and the creator of YourGods.com.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Cornwell. Welcome to The Road to Reason. So Rob, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, in the past, we've had a couple of shows where we talked about complementary and alternative medicines and therapies, also about the anti-vaccination movement. So we've done a few things that address kind of bogus medicine and bogus science. I think that skeptics, whether they're atheists or not, often find themselves in a battle against pseudoscience.
Right.
There's a book where I first came across the title. It's called Big Pharma. And just seeing that, I thought, is this another crank that wrote this? Because as you know, in the alternative medicine community, they're often very quick to say that the pharmaceutical companies are terrible and evil, therefore you should believe all of our nonsense, despite that there's no real good evidence for it. So this is written by Ben Goldacre. It turns out he's not a crank at all. This is a physician in England. He writes a column for The Guardian called Bad Science, and he's been debunking a lot of the things that we've talked about for many years. More recently, he put out a book called Bad Pharma, and the actual full title is How Drug Companies Mislead Doctors and Harm Patients. If you ever watch if you've ever watched Dr. Goldacre on YouTube, he's incredibly energetic and lively and funny. And I think it says something that he picked a title that's not cutesy, it's not funny. He really is talking about in his book how the drug companies are doing a bunch of bad things, and it has real harm on real people. So we'll kind of go over his book in a little bit. First, I thought we could talk about how science is supposed to work, and then get to how it actually does work, practically speaking. One of the things I thought we could start off with is if you tell us a little bit about heuristics and how human beings have evolved to actually approach problems.
Right. Human beings evolved during the Pleistocene, and what was going on then were very highly complex social interactions. Animals can evolve to resolve simple problems and consistent problems, but humans evolved to solve complex situations that were constantly changing. And that's why humans actually became very, very good at what they do and why they've survived and why they've populated the planet. But we are incredibly complex. Now, that allows us to be very, very flexible in terms of unique situations and unique problems. And that allowed us, that sense has allowed us to delve into things that our brains were never evolved to resolve, like quantum physics or Shakespeare or how to read and write, things like that, which were not really advantageous to us from a strictly survival, being able to raise children and find mates and survive. But with that type of complexity, what do we do though when the situation demands something very, very quick to respond to? And that's where heuristics come in. They sort of save us from overthinking a problem. Instead of, gee, is that rustling in the bushes, is that the wind, or is it a lion about to jump out and eat me? And what are the statistical probabilities that it could possibly be a lion? Well, it's probably the wind. By the time you finish the sentence,
as we evolved, we didn't have time for all that cortical thinking.
And all that. So you want to be able to have these heuristics to resolve problems very quickly. So if somebody is approaching you and they look like they might be dangerous, you would, of course, take guard against yourself. Or you might think that person's very friendly, and then you wouldn't react badly toward that person. So there's all kinds of things that our brain does to react quickly.
Stuff like for fight or flight or for reproductive opportunities.
Right.
We're very well attuned to those, but not as well attuned to some of the more complex things that our new society.
Well, our brains are capable of resolving those issues. I mean, that's why we do have a very complex society. That's why we do have very complex science, and we have technology the way we do, because our brains are so capable of expanding into areas and resolving very unique problems. That's something we're just extraordinarily good at. But we still have to have these heuristics to resolve very easy, quick problems that we can't just stand around and wondering, what do I do? Let me calculate that out. Let me get out my HP and figure out
so sometimes
what to
we
do.
need a shortcut so we can react immediately to a potentially dangerous thing or to a great opportunity. Other times we need the brain that's evolved through our socialization to address these really complicated problems.
And the problem occurs when we use that quick heuristic and we apply it to the very complex science and technology. That's when we start having issues, because it's you might say we can be very lazy with our brains. That's been one of the theories. I don't think that explains it quite all, but we can be very lazy, and confirmation bias or the other biases, availability bias, there's tons of them, heuristics. They allow us to kind of be a little bit lazy, so we might apply it to something that's far more complex. And a lot of times that may be fine. It may be a situation that we're never going to encounter again, and it's no big deal. But when we apply it to technology and science, and then base our decisions on that, or the decisions on how we take care of our family, and then we start seeing some problems.
Right. And also, I guess there's one point I'd like to make is that it's not critical that everybody learns statistics in a really deep manner or understands all about science in a very, very thorough manner again. But I think it's important that people understand enough about it so they can differentiate between quacks and cranks that are just abusing the system versus people that have dedicated 30 years to science, in a bench lab that, use statistics to really confirm something. They should be taken, what they say about climate change or whatever it is in a very different spirit than somebody who's trying to, sell a magical potion for $20. And I think it would help us if more people knew enough about science, enough about the scientific method to distinguish between those two. And you had brought up confirmation bias. Can you talk about that, a little bit to expand on that?
Confirmation bias is simply our desire to confirm very firm beliefs that we already have. That can, in fact, be somewhat useful. We want to believe our family members are good people, and we may ignore the things that we don't like, and we will take into consider the things that we do like. But confirmation bias can actually, for example, someone sees a driver doing something stupid and then realizes that it's a woman driving, and that confirms that, oh, all women drivers are bad drivers. That's a good example of the kind of confirmation bias. It doesn't have any statistical whereabouts, and actually when you look at the insurance data, women have far fewer accidents than men. So, how do you want to judge who's a better driver? So confirmation bias can be used to also, if you, for example, you go into a restaurant that you really like and you just happen to have some bad service, well, you may still go back to that restaurant again. You might not just completely take it off your list of restaurants because your bias is that it's always been a good restaurant with good service.
Right. I was listening to a tape on the way over about memory and how memory is a very active process. So it's almost like, so you'll go to that restaurant, the food's not that great, but your bias is so strong that you'll start to add things and later re-remember it that, oh, it wasn't so bad, or, it was pretty good, or, hey, we should go back to this place, it's excellent food.
Yeah.
And that works in all sorts of things. So I guess the confirmational bias can help with social cohesion at times. It can also lead to prejudice, hyper-nationalism, all sorts of other, potentially risky things. Now, again, we've spoken that the human brain isn't necessarily better or worse than other brains. It's just evolved to sort of meet our needs as a species. Is that fair to say?
Well, it meets our needs, but it's gone beyond that. Our brains do much more than we needed to just to simply survive and reproduce. That's why we're the only animal on the planet with the kind of complex brain that's capable of doing language and being able to do mathematics and things like that in a very complex way. So it has
so it meets our needs in our advanced civilization.
It meets our needs in our advanced civilization, but you have to remember the reason why we have an advanced civilization is because we had this brain that was very flexible. So, and that's what allowed us to advance civilization to where we are today.
Okay. All right. Now, one of the things that we do, in this civilization is we use science to help us figure stuff out in a better way that our heuristics or whatever less complicated process might lead us to different conclusions. So for the scientific method, in a very simplest system, you need to learn a little bit about the subject, Then you generate a hypothesis. Then you want to test that hypothesis. You want to look at the data, analyze it, formulate a decision, like did this prove your hypothesis or disprove it? And then one of the key things that Dr. Goldacre harps on a lot is then you need to report that. If you're doing a study and you don't report it, you have to, everybody keeps rebuilding the wheel because they don't have that information. And worse yet, if you only report all the positive findings, then you're setting this up where the people that do go look at it, like scientists or doctors to try to make treatment decisions, they only see all these positive things. It's very skewed in favor of things working. So I want to quickly run through some things that we do in the scientific method. When it gets really boring or dry, you'll kick me under the table and we'll move on to something else. So a good hypothesis has to be falsifiable. Scientists are always trying to think of ways to frame a question so that you can do a test on it and you have to be able to falsify it. Richard Dawkins argues that God should be treated as a hypothesis. If so, you might think that the prevalence of rape, miscarriages of embryonic souls, childhood leukemia, all these things could weigh against the hypothesis that there's an omnipotent, benevolent God that's personally involved in looking after all of us. People that are true believers, they sort of take the opposite method and say, no, there's no possible way you can falsify this hypothesis. It's a matter of faith. And that sort of underlines some of the anti-science that we've seen going on for years here in the United States. And do you just throw up your hands at that if they're not going to let you falsify their claims with solid evidence? There's only so much you can do about it. Another thing is that a hypothesis has to be testable. Again, scientists routinely figure out very clever ways to go and test some stuff. Stars are millions of light years away, so it's been said that we can never learn much about them. And science eventually sort of cracked some codes and realized if they emit a certain spectrum of light at a certain intensity, and they can compare it to supernovas in the area that act as like a standard candle, all of a sudden we can make very good predictions about how far away they are and calculate the expansion of the universe. So we've come so far with science and the things that by very cleverly applying our logic and our human brain. And then you look at the contrast with, I think it was William Craig, one of the Christian apologists, who in a debate said that, well, no, Christianity is a testable hypothesis. All you skeptics have to do is go find Christ's grave, find his body, and drag that 2,000-year-old body back, show it to me, and then I'll believe the ascension didn't occur and that I'm not,
right.
So again, they take it out.
Well, the assumption is that Christ even existed, which is, up to, for some scholars, Christ may very well just be a conglomerate of different types of prophets who were roaming around the time. I do want to go back to the testable hypothesis and being able to falsify it. One of the problems, it's great when you talk about things like physics and maths and things like that, because these are they're called the hard sciences for a reason. It's because you really can test whether or not something works if you're capable of designing the test. When you throw humans into the mix, then we start having problems because humans are not really that controllable in terms of how they operate. They have these enormous brains and they can be easily swayed by simply giving them a bit of information before an experiment. You might throw some numbers at them and that throwing some numbers at them before they go into the experiment can actually alter the outcome of the experiment. And that's how and that's something that makes studying humans either in medical studies as well as, of course, any psychological studies, anthropological or social studies, sociology studies. That's what makes it very, very difficult. And sometimes that's why it's called the soft sciences and we get scoffed at by many people who study the hard sciences. And it's really very, very difficult and to try to find a way of testing human subjects so that you can get a falsifiable or you can support the hypothesis. So with humans, you really have to do far more studies than you would, say, if you were doing something, trying to do a proof in maths. I mean, often, somebody getting their PhD in maths, their PhD is 5 pages long. And whereas in psychology, it's huge because you're amassing quite a bit of data. Where coming up with a proof for a mathematical equation is
right. That's right.
It's
one thing's very cut and dry,
there.
And
the other one is not. So so as soon as we start talking any kind of medicine, things like that, we're throwing in this element that's can throw everything off. And that's why we have to do things like double-blind studies, and we have placebo
I want to talk about that in a
effects.
second. There's a few different kinds of studies. Broadly speaking, you can break it into observational studies or an experimental one. For the observational, you can talk about a cross-sectional study where you just look at one spot in time. You study, measure all the parameters that you want to test, and then do your analysis. You can look at longitudinal studies, either where you start with a group that has a disease, let's say, or something you're interested in, follow them forward, or backward if you're doing a retrospective study to go through the data from other studies that were already completed. Or you can do a cohort study where they don't have the disease, but you're following a segment of the population, 15 to 20-year-old black males, to see if they develop a certain problem, whatever it is. So that's a cohort study. And I think for our audience, we're going to skip over most of those details, so don't get kicked. But I would like you to tell us a little bit about what's usually considered the gold standard in studies, if you're able to do it, if you have enough money, if you can get enough patients, if you have a whole organization behind you. Why do we like to use randomized, controlled, double-blind studies? What are some of the important things? We talked about bias a little bit, but can you explain why is it important to randomize? What's the risk if you don't do that? Why do we need to make sure it's a double-blind study? What does that mean? And then why do we need a control group?
Right. Yeah. If you had a perfect world where you could, and you had the money and the time and everything to do that, that's terrific, and it is really important. One, confirmation bias does play a big role here, because scientists are just humans, and we have our little pet theories and our hypotheses, and we want to be right. Obviously, we want to be right. Although I actually think some of the best scientists are the ones who, when they're wrong, are able to take that, finding out they're wrong, and going in the next step.
But that's supposed to be a key element about all science, that you don't do a test because you already know the answer. You do the test to find out an important answer that might help change the way we treat people, or push science toward a new area. And it's inappropriate for a scientist to get offended because they messed up and walk off in a huff. You're supposed to look at the data, realize what happened, and sometimes your colleagues will point out, you didn't blind this thing right, or you didn't use the right control group here.
Or your hypothesis was just wrong.
Right, exactly.
So there's lots of things, I mean, you could, there's lots of things to look at. And it can be frustrating, and you're trying to get grant money and so on. I mean, we won't get into those kind of details, but science is not an easy business. But the confirmation bias, in order to try to get rid of that, you want to be rid of that. So a double-blind study means that you're not seeing the person who's actually doing the experiment with the subject. This is with a human subject, or it actually can be with non-human. You can actually get confirmation bias with non-human. You don't tell it's usually a graduate student who's running the experiment. Thank goodness for graduate students. You don't tell them what the study is about or what answer you're expecting. You just give them the protocols, and they have to follow the protocols. And the protocols need to be followed pretty rigidly throughout all the experiments with every subject, whether it be non-human or human animal. And then the data is just simply collected. You don't usually have the names, if it's human subjects, are not associated with the data so whoever then starts doing the statistics, and if you really want to, you have a couple of different people doing the statistics and looking at it, and who may not know what your hypotheses are, because humans, we know.
So it's like they take every measure you can to avoid the bias.
To avoid the bias, because we are so good at fooling ourselves. I mean, the human mind is really good at tricking ourselves into believing what we want to believe. And it doesn't mean that the scientist is being dishonest, or it just means that we can make mistakes that favor our expected outcome. And so you want to get rid of that.
So if a doctor walks in and says, this is one of the strongest painkillers we've ever had, take this now, let me know in half an hour if it's helping you, you'll get a very different result than if they hear you mumbling outside the door, yeah, this one just got the sugar pill, and walk in.
Right, exactly.
You should expect to see differences.
Or saying something you may or may not get any difference. People vary. You may respond, you may not respond. That would be, one way for a doctor to really try to get an understanding of what the patient's feeling. That may be something. But that's why it's called the placebo effect, is you can give people sugar pills and they will actually feel better. Again, that shows just how powerful the mind is in being able to persuade ourselves what we're feeling, whether it be, here's a pill that's going to make you anxious. And you can give a sugar pill to someone and say, this pill will probably make you anxious in the next 30 minutes. And sure enough, you can get a subject to start sweating and pacing and becoming very anxious.
All right, Dr. Goldacre goes over some very convincing evidence. First, like if you give somebody 2 placebo pills instead of 1 for their pain, it works better. If you give them 4 instead of 2, that works better still. If you give them IV with just salt water in it, that works really well, because you have such a vigorous intervention that it must be really real.
Right, it must work.
And then I don't know if this is his term, he talked about the nocebo effect instead of the placebo effect, where they can give all these noxious things. So they tell the patients, we're doing this test, this is supposed to be really good for this one thing, but we've heard it has terrible side effects with vomiting. Right. And so then you do the test, and so then the ones that got told that are having that problem. So they are very real. So it's important, I guess, for everybody to know the placebo effect from a sugar pill or something that doesn't have any medication is very real and it's very measurable, and you need to take that into account in your studies. And so with homeopathic remedies and all these things that purposefully don't want to look at it, they just want to say, look, this made 30% of people feel better. Mm-hmm. If a back rub makes 30% of everybody feel better, as opposed to doing it with acupuncture, you need to set up and we can talk about control groups too, I guess. Why do you need a control group as part of that randomized trial, as opposed to, why do you need a control group?
Well, control group allows you, you want to have different groups that you have, that you apply different treatments to, for example. And the control group may not have anything done to them, but they may have back pain, say. And so you don't do anything different, but you ask them how their back pain's going, because back pain, for example, and I suffer from back pain, some days are better than others. And so with a control group, you'll know if you're not doing anything to that control group, you're just tracking their pain, you'll see that their pain goes up and down and up and down, and sometimes it will naturally get better. We find this with a lot of things. I mean, you have a common cold. When you get a common cold, you eventually get better. It's not big, and then you will have your different treatment groups with, some may be getting a placebo, some may be getting the actual drug, some may be getting a derivative of the drug, some may be getting a drug that's already been tested and proven, and to see if one works better than the other. And so then you look at the statistical differences between all your groups. And this is where the statistics come in to be really, really important, is there's some very definite ways we measure statistics, and 0.05 or 0.01 is, usually kind of the gold standard is 0.01. If you
and we're not going to have a lot of time to go into it, but with the statistics, there's several key things to understand that science does this very differently than alternative medicine or just any anti or non-science thing, where you have a sensitivity, where a test has how good you are at picking up all of the true positives or the real disease out there, and a specificity, how good you are if you do a test at excluding all the things that aren't real. A probability, where based on the study, how powerful, how many people you have in it, how big the control group to the experimental group, how big that difference is, you can calculate with a good statistician ahead of time how many patients you actually need to detect these real differences, and then you have to take practical matters into account. Ideally, you would test the entire population to know something.
Yeah,
since
that's not going to happen.
You can't do that, you have to figure out how to do a sample.
Right.
And that's where randomization comes in a little bit.
Right.
That you can't just, if you want to prove something, you can take all of the healthiest looking people in there, give them your vitamin pill, and they're going to be pretty healthy. So you have to randomize to get your whole population, and then see if they're really doing any better.
Right. And you may only want to be testing a certain segment of the population, but you want to randomize within that too. So obviously, if you're looking at heart patients, you're not going to pick 20-year-olds with really good hearts to see if the heart, it would put them at risk. So there are lots of things. Again, when you're planning your experiment, you want to talk about with this statistician, a really good statistician, how the population you need, the size, because if the size is if you have too many people, you may get a false positive. So it becomes very tricky. And that's why replication becomes so important. And that is really key to studying in science, is replication. Because
and you mean when like another group can read your protocol, see exactly what you did? And
redo it. Because statistically speaking, if you run enough experiments, random experiments, you will always find a few false positives, and you'll find some. So you want to make sure that that doesn't happen, and so by repeating the experiment, you want to be able to you're able to see whether or not that experiment came out and gave you the wrong answer.
Right, and by having another group who doesn't have your same agenda necessarily, isn't being paid by the same drug company, whatever it is,
right.
If they replicate it, or several other people do, then it gets a lot of credence. We only have a couple minutes left before we run out of time. About halfway through Big Pharma, one of Goldacre's best lines, I think, is that if you've already seen the results of your test, you've seen the data already, you can't then go back and generate your hypothesis.
Right.
And that's like you were saying, if you're going to have false positives of the data. If you measure 20 different variables and your cutoff is only 5% of the time it would randomly be right, then out of those 20, a couple of them are probably randomly going to look like statistically significant. And so if you then go back and say, well, our study was actually looking for these things, and we're not a headache drug, we're an anti-diarrheal agent, and you market it that way. And this stuff happens all the time by the big drug companies, unfortunately. It causes real harm. It changes the way doctors are prescribing medications to people. If one of the bad things is when they bury all these negative results. If a company does a test, doesn't show the results they were hoping for, and then it disappears and doesn't get into the literature, all the doctors can't find that.
Right.
And there's often gag orders so that the people doing the study can't go and talk about it freely. There's been some steps to try to, like form registers where when you make a protocol, everybody should have to be in a register so people can go back and see what all the trials that were conducted and then try to harvest the information. But practically speaking, some lip service has been done, but it's still very, very hard to get access to that data.
And plus, what doctor is really going to have time to go back and start running experiments? Most doctors aren't trained. I mean, they learn early on how to run experiments, and then that's it. Then they're done with it.
That's right.
They've done it. They've done
clinical.
it. So, and they're not going to go back and download the data. So
you're right. It's very hard. All right. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on Road to Reason.